The union workers were run by the Mafia, and they had been schooled to play D&D, or deaf and dumb, whenever an authority figure came around asking questions. The Navy needed the Mafia to help them infiltrate these areas, and if they didn't help, they were going to have zero chance of success.
An excerpt from today's guest will discuss the uneasy relationship the U.S. government had with the mob during World War II. Author Matthew Black is here, and I'll speak with him right after this break. I'm Robert Child, and this is Point of the Spear. Today's guest is a labor and crime historian who was recruited by James P. Hoffa's office in 2016 to author Dave Beck, A Teamsters Life. He has also worked as a staff writer for the San Diego Union-Tribune and published dozens of articles on History101.com. He is a graduate of the University of Washington with an honors degree in history. His book is called Operation Underworld: How the Mafia and the U.S. government teamed up to win World War II. And author Matthew Black joins us now. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
It's a real honor, sir. And as I was reading through your book, there was an incident that actually was the catalyst where, in New York, where the Mafia came in to assist the U.S. government, and they reached out to them. What was that incident that got the Mafia involved?
Yeah, pretty public incidents. On February 9th, 1942, very early in the World War II, or the U.S.'s involvement in World War II, there was a ship called the SS Normandy, and it was docked at Pier 88 in West Manhattan. It had previously been built by the French, but the U.S. government seized the boat after France fell to the Germans. The ship was enormous. It was bigger than Titanic, and we were converting it to a troop transport ship. It could ferry 15,000 men across the ocean in one journey, and it was even fast enough to outrun any U-boats that chased her. The first line of the book reads, "The fire started with a spark in the Grand Salon on the promenade deck of SS Normandy." The prologue of the book goes through this incident, but what happened was a fire started aboard this massive ship, which was one of the most important ships in the Atlantic Fleet at the time. Tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of onlookers watched as the ship burned in port. There had already been a lot of talk about spies, and there was real fear that saboteurs could infiltrate the harbor and destroy U.S. ships and their cargo. At the time, they didn't know what caused the fire, and the Navy, who was tasked with protecting the port of New York, carried on as if the ship had indeed been sabotaged. Naval intelligence commanders knew that they needed their men to infiltrate the areas in the port where they were most vulnerable, but they couldn't do that because the organizations, which were the unions that controlled these areas, would not cooperate. The union workers were run by the Mafia, and they had been schooled to play D&D, or deaf and dumb, whenever an authority figure came around asking questions. The Navy needed the Mafia to help them infiltrate these areas, and if they didn't help, they were going to have zero chance of success.
There were two figures that were sort of the figureheads, not the figureheads, but the two guiding influences that helped the government. Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, who were well-known mobsters, and they knew each other as kids. What was their assistance? What did they do to assist the government?
And they knew each other since they were kids. They're good friends. They're thick as thieves, and both are extremely intelligent, especially Lansky. The Navy Mafia alliance didn't start with these two figures, as lower level gangsters were recruited by the Navy first. Lansky probably caught wind of Operation Underworld through Frank Costello, who was Luciano's acting boss. And Luciano was in prison in 1942, so he wasn't involved in the early days of the operation. But it was men from his family that were the biggest help to the Navy. And as for Lansky, he had already established himself as an anti-fascist, as he was Jewish and had openly fought against Nazi sympathizers in New York City. When Lansky was asked to help, he was more than willing. His first task was to get Luciano to cooperate with the Navy. It was not an easy thing to ask Luciano, and it took a lot of convincing.
What was the element that made him come on board? What convinced him to come on board?
Right. Well, there's some evidence that that the government made a deal with him in exchange for his freedom. Um, it's not clear that that was offered to him right away, but it does seem that Lansky was instrumental in convincing him that cooperating the government would certainly help his cause if a deal were to be struck.
As the war progressed, did these mobsters and the organization provide vital information to the government?
Definitely. I mean, people who were in the Luciano family and the other New York families provided scores of information to the Navy that was very important. Much of what they passed back and forth is a catalyst for some of the best parts in the book. But for Lansky and Luciano, that wasn't really their role in Operation Underworld to provide information. They mostly opened up doors for the Navy.
I see.
Yeah, they knew the right places to focus, the right people to contact, and when they said that they wanted something done, avenues were opened up for the Navy that they just couldn't have possibly passed through without them. So their involvement basically solidified cooperation between the Navy and Mafia. And investigators have concluded that these men weren't offered anything in return for their service. Kind of getting back to what I said, they were told that they owed it to their country. And there may have been a deal, there may have been the promise of a deal, or maybe they would look at a deal down the road, but most of them were not given a deal. And so for Luciano, he was looking at decades more in prison, and it was just, he had a lot to gain from cooperating with the government.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. Next time, learn the fascinating history of the Vietnam-era race riots aboard the USS Kitty Hawk with author Marv Truhe.
But from the very beginning, he was punishing black sailors more severely than he was punishing white sailors for the same offenses. And in this case, it involved assaults. The first couple of incidents, he punished black sailors by throwing them in the brig for 30 days, diet of bread and water, busted them and ranked and fined them. And he had 4 different incidents of white sailors assaulting black sailors, both in port and on the ship. And in each case, he basically let them skate.
Another reason to click that follow button so you'll be notified when the episode releases. Now, the naval commander of the operation, Charles Heffernan, is that his name?
Haffenden, yeah.
Haffenden. What happened to him after the war? I thought it was really interesting, his involvement with this operation.
Yeah, a lot of people who pick up this book will know about characters like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, but Commander Haffenden, much less known, naval intelligence commander, and by virtue a very secretive person. But he's no less interesting. He's a fascinating case, and in the end, really, his is a sad story, I feel. I don't want to give away how the end turns out or the ultimate fate of the characters, but suffice to say, there's a reason why this story has gone mostly unknown for so long. The Navy went to extraordinary efforts that I won't get into, because you'll have to read the book.
Absolutely. Yeah.
To make sure, that this story never got out. And this effort by the Navy, I'll say, certainly played a role in Haffenden's fate.
And I read at the end of the book, and I won't give it away, that he was very concerned about his fate.
He was, yeah. I mean, probably a very common theme among people, when you reach a certain age and you're looking back at your life and you're thinking about legacy, and he's certainly, these were extraordinary events, and he wanted people to know about them.
Absolutely. Now, I don't know if this is giving away the book, but Lucky Luciano ended up being deported. Is that correct?
Yeah. And, I guess, enough people know about Lucky Luciano to know that, he was deported in February of 1946. But, readers will learn about Luciano's participation in Operation Underworld. So, it won't be a mystery to them that he did indeed help the U.S. with the war effort. But at the time, this was not known. In fact, it was a tightly held secret. And sure enough, there was some press out there that hinted at the government's secret alliance with the mafia. A radio broadcaster named Walter Winchell even reported that Luciano was up for the Medal of Honor.
I was going to mention that, actually.
Yeah, which is completely absurd. But when Luciano was deported, people began to ask why. He still had decades left on his sentence after all. So accusations came flying in that the man who pardoned and deported him, who was the governor at the time, Thomas Dewey, who also just happened to be the man who prosecuted Luciano and put him behind bars, that he had accepted a bribe from Luciano in exchange for his freedom. The rumors really never went away, and they persisted so much and for so long that Dewey even commissioned an investigation to explore the question of if Luciano did indeed help the war effort. And that was important for him because they say, hey, this is the reason why he was pardoned, not because of some bribe that didn't happen. And this investigation actually provides most of the information for this book. So, ultimately it was Luciano's cooperation during the war years that led to his pardon and subsequent deportation.
Now, in hindsight, Operation Underworld was a success as a program? And are there lessons perhaps for today?
I think, Operation Underworld accomplished its mission, certainly, in that it protected the port of New York during the largest conflict the world has ever known. When measured against what their objective was, protecting ships in the harbor, making sure there was no disruption of cargo passing, from New York, to England and Europe. The Navy and mainly Commander Haffenden did a stellar job. But what makes it complicated is that their efforts also empowered the mafia and led to some very questionable behavior by naval officers, that Haffenden included, probably chief among them. It's also pretty clear that some of their measures were a bit extreme. Sort of like sending a pit bull to pick up a rose. It may have been a little over the top. So there's lessons there too. And in fact, the title of one of the chapters is, When You Dance with the Devil. And of course,
I saw that.
Yeah. And there's a Smith quote, it ends with, if you dance with the devil, then you haven't got a clue, for you think you changed the devil, but the devil changes you, and this certainly was the case for a number of those naval officers. And, they were, these fears were brought up in the beginning, but they decided to go for it anyway. And, for deep cover operatives, we saw this a little in the story of Donnie Brasco, which turned into a movie, with Johnny Depp and Al Pacino, was based on the true story of an FBI agent, and the lure of the mafia is powerful, and it's capable of corrupting even the most honest of people. And, you'll see that in the book. And this was kind of the first time that, a government outfit was looking at, cooperating with the mafia and infiltrating them. And then that's sort of, book doesn't get into this because we're about Operation Underworld, but in terms of, the FBI's efforts to, attack the mafia in later decades, you could see these methods kind of being born in Operation Underworld.
The book is called Operation Underworld: How the Mafia and the U.S. government teamed up to win World War II. Matthew, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode. Thanks so much for joining me. Next time, learn the fascinating history of the Vietnam-era race riots aboard the USS Kitty Hawk with author Marv Truhe.
But from the very beginning, he was punishing black sailors more severely than he was punishing white sailors for the same offenses. And in this case, it involved assaults. The first couple of incidents, he punished black sailors by throwing them in the brig for 30 days, diet of bread and water, busted them and ranked and fined them. And he had 4 different incidents of white sailors assaulting black sailors, both in port and on the ship. And in each case, he basically let them skate.
Another program you won't want to miss. And if you like what you hear, leave a review or a rating, or just click the follow button. And be sure to check out our Point of the Spear YouTube channel with bonus video material plus full military history documentaries. There's tons to explore, and I hope you check it out. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.